Okay, I now welcome officers from the Australian Federal Police, the Attorney General's Department and the Australian Crime Commission. Now, our intention is to get as much of this on the public record as is suitable, but noting the nature of the matters we'll be discussing, if there's anything that you'd feel uncomfortable with being on the public record and you'd like to say in camera, I think that's eminently reasonable, and we may go in camera at the later part of this session if that works. So if everyone's sorry, I'm just not sure who's from where. So if you're able to just, for the Hansford record, introduce yourself and state the capacity in which you appear.
Good morning. I'm Dr. John Allen Moss, National Manager, Operational Intelligence from the Australian Crime Commission.
Hamish, National Manager, Strategic Intelligence and Strategy, Australian Crime Commission.
Jared Taggart from the Australian Federal Police from the Criminal Assets Task Force.
Tony Alderman, Acting Manager, Strategic Policy, Australian Federal Police.
Daniel MOSSOP, Acting Director of the Financial Crime Section in the Attorney General's Department.
Fantastic, thank you. I know that we've got submissions from the AFP and the AG's department, and thank you for them, and thank you for participation in our inquiry. Look, before we begin, I'm going to ask you if there's any opening remarks, opening statements any of you would like to make. Okay, there being none, I may start. Look, just in terms of just a little bit of taking one step back and just explaining to you kind of how we've got here and why we're here. Effectively, we wanted to have a conversation in a bipartisan nature through the Australian Parliament about how we tackle these issues and these new technologies. What's the best way to create the right regulatory framework within Australia to help these industries grow, at the same time addressing what are very legitimate concerns that people have. In this process, perhaps different from other Senate inquiries from time to time, it's very much a learning experience for us as well, where rather than coming at something with clear political positions that are kind of being thrashed out in a public forum, for us a lot of this has been about kind of learning about the technology and learning about the risks and learning about the opportunities. I may start by asking if you did want to, and I know obviously the submission from the Australian Federal Police and the Attorney General's Department go to the heart of some of this, but if you wanted to kind of outline, or if I could ask you to outline some of your kind of concerns or what you think the challenges are from the areas that obviously your expertise is in, while we address these kinds of the right regulatory environment and framework for the industry. So if you wanted to, however you wanted to divvy up answering that amongst yourselves.
So maybe if I can kick off on the kind of the broader kind of policy, I guess, challenges that present to us. I think probably first and foremost is that digital currency and cryptocurrencies have evolved in a way that isn't covered currently by Australia's anti-money laundering regime. So I guess that's an issue for us in that at the time the Act was drafted, we didn't really think about these types of currencies.
When was the Act drafted, just out of interest?
It came into force in 2006,
okay.
So there was a few years of drafting before that. And we covered e-currency to the extent that it was currency which was backed by bullion or backed by a fiat currency. Yep. But the way that cryptocurrencies have evolved, they're kind of backed by mathematical-based formulas and kind of slow release, that mining process. So I guess the first question for us is about how it sits in the anti-money laundering regime, because it has a lot of characteristics which make it quite attractive for the use for money laundering and terrorism financing. It's got a kind of pseudo-anonymous features about it where you don't necessarily need to be identified. You're only identified by potentially an email address, which can be set up, as anybody. And it has the ability to move peer-to-peer. There's no centralised point. So the current regime in Australia for the industries which are regulated by the AML Act is that AUSTRAC get a record of every transaction of every cent that goes into and comes out of the country. Now, with cryptocurrencies, because they can be transferred peer-to-peer, you can send them directly to somebody, they can cross borders and payment be made directly to people anywhere in the world. So it's not going to sit nicely within our regime, because while we might have some visibility of the on-ramps and off-ramps in the places where they intersect directly with the financial sector, short of having everybody who has a Bitcoin and makes a transaction report to AUSTRAC, it's going to be very difficult to find a kind of a point where all those transactions are collated in a way that they can be reported. So that's a big challenge for us, because we're going to lose visibility of how these Bitcoins move around once they're inside the Bitcoin system. We can see people buying them, we can see people selling them to a large extent, but we lose visibility of what happens within the system. So that's a particular challenge for us in trying to work out how to regulate them, because they are slightly different to the kind of existing methods that exist. I think probably the other challenge for us is in trying to conceptualise, in trying to regulate in a way that doesn't stifle their growth, because we do acknowledge that there's a range of kind of useful and worthwhile purposes for digital currency. It obviously has I think, as the previous witness was saying, they have the ability to vastly increase the financial inclusion for people who are currently unbanked. It's a relatively cheap and effective way for people to hold and store value and move it around easily without, with relatively limited fees. So it's not something that it's something that we would like to see used in a positive way, but also in a way that we can try and mitigate those risks. So I guess those are the two key challenges. The other challenges are things that we aren't really aware of. I mean, Bitcoin is the obvious virtual currency, and it's the one that everybody's talking about, but the way that it's created, there's no reason why people couldn't create different ones, or ones with slightly different features and aspects, and ones that are kind of almost hidden. And that makes it very difficult to try and legislate or try and regulate in a way that's future-proof, because there's a lot of anticipation and kind of trying to second guess where the technology will go and what way it will lead, in a way that you can regulate to try and prevent having to come back and re-regulate again in a relatively short amount of time for a new product that comes out. And the pace of innovation is proving, I guess, not just in our field, because in a number of fields, a particular challenge. So I think they're probably some of the key policy challenges that we're looking at, and we've got a review of the AML-CTF Act that's currently underway, and that's looking at some of these issues and that's one of the kind of key things that we're looking at, is how we can regulate new and emerging technologies and new payment systems, including virtual currencies.
Did anyone else want to kind of jump in as part of that?
Can I make a few comments about the nature of the law enforcement response? I think it's fair to say that across a whole range of different areas, it's becoming more and more difficult to investigate and prosecute crime. And this is just another type of encryption, if you like, on a whole range of different areas, from communications, where we're seeing encrypted communications, and I know Parliament's looking at the telecommunications interception reforms at the moment, right through to the use of dark nets or hidden parts of the internet, and the payment through virtual currencies. So the way in which law enforcement responds to a digital currency issue needs to change over time, and I'm sure my colleagues could share a number of examples about how we do that. But I think as the basic premise is, it's becoming more difficult to investigate with the higher levels of encryption.
And I think, Senator, the main challenge for the AFP operationally is the anonymity associated with Bitcoins and the lack of regulation. And as Hamish has indicated, the challenges we face in terms of determining the true owners of Bitcoins or any other form of digital currency. So that's operationally, whilst they may not be something that is a significant issue for us at the moment, it's more in the future space where things like this, if there were predictions that they may become more popular and more user-friendly, that could become an issue if there wasn't an ability for us to understand the true ownership behind Bitcoins.
And just to build on that as well, so obviously profit is one of the key motivating factors for criminal activity, and particularly organised criminal activity, and so we're very interested in terms of digital currencies to the extent that it may either facilitate that criminal activity or alternatively become the value that is derived from that criminal activity. And as Attorney General's Department was saying, the extent to which digital currencies are divorced from the regulated framework, not just the anonymity of the currency itself, but the fact that it doesn't actually interface in many cases with our regulated currency markets, makes it difficult, one, to identify the flows of that digital currency, and also in some cases, because the value is stored not in Australia, can also provide a number of challenges in terms of being able to recover the proceeds of crime in that way as well.
I've got a few more, George. Okay. Just on that though, I mean, the bigger question, and this is probably the point that the previous speaker, Mr. Antonopoulos, was making, was that in a strange way, regardless of what we sit here and discuss and decide, a lot of this technology is coming anyway. You know, I mean, we can't stop it happening. You know, regardless of, I mean, effectively we can push it overseas and we can push the industry into other places in overseas.
Do it on Wicker.
Do it on Wicker. But
I just got a Wicker message.
Too soon.
I didn't know about Wicker until yesterday.
It's Snapchat for politicians. But taking out, it's some of this is coming anyway. And I note, Mr. MOSSOP, in your submission from the Attorney General's Department, you very kind of eloquently outline the concerns and saying this is part of the problems. I guess what we're hoping to be able to do as part of this process, and perhaps some of this is something you take on notice and come back to us with in time as part of this process, is we want to be able to, ideally, be able to present a bipartisan approach and say, look, this is the best way of addressing the security concerns, this is the best way of addressing some of the taxation concerns, this is the best way of addressing some of the industry growth concerns. If I could ask you to take on notice, and I know you're doing this in other spaces, in other fields, and it's a bit different to do it through the Economics Committee, but to be able to for us to be able to produce a bit of a whole of government approach on how to deal with these issues, if you're able, as part of, to take on notice, just some ideas and recommendations about how we'd actually be able to address the concerns. Noting the concerns are very, I mean, everything you've outlined, Mr. MOSSOP, I mean, is all very real, but also noting that because it is coming, I think it would be improper for us to be giving the government a report that's a whole of kind of a bipartisan report and approach saying this is how we address all these issues and not tackle this big part of it. So I know now is probably not the time to outline. If you've got some ideas and views, certainly share them now. But if it is something you are able to take on notice, we'll certainly write to you in coming weeks about that.
We might hear from them later about that.
Yes.
If we go on camera.
Sorry. Okay, Chair. Thank you. To start with, I just wanted to start with the 2006 laws, and you mentioned that they cover e-currencies, e-gold and all that sort of stuff. What experience have you had in regulating those, and how effective have the regulations been, given presumably some of the cross-border issues we're talking about here also would relate to other forms of e-currency, not necessarily cryptocurrencies?
I guess from Attorney General's point of view, we haven't the laws that we have that cover e-currency work quite well to cover those currencies, but I don't think they ever really took off and had the same.
So you haven't had a great level of experience or regulatory oversight or need to for these currencies. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I guess they are. They exist and they are regulated in the same way that all the other kind of financial designated services are covered in the Act. And AUSTRAC gets reports on the movement of those currencies, and that works quite well in that we can see how those currencies like e-gold and I think there's a few others around, but I don't think they ever had the same potential as Bitcoin, and because they were covered, they operated in the same way as regular currency, and they never really captured the.
I mean, how are they covered exactly?
imagination.
I don't understand this at all, and I don't understand these laws. I'm just conceptually thinking that if I wanted to hide myself using e-gold, I could probably hide myself just as well as using Bitcoin in terms of not, setting up an account with just an email address, doing my transactions through companies based in other countries that don't necessarily have the laws we do. I mean, how do our laws capture those e-currencies right now? How do you get the information, or what aspects of the laws allow you to do what you need to do?
So anybody who's providing a service, which is laid out in the Act, so anybody who's opening an account, because those currencies are centralised and have a kind of a single point where the transactions flow through, there is a central point that can report to AUSTRAC, so it sees the...
And that's the financial institution holding the gold, offering the services.
Holding the e-currency, so...
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Right.
I mean...
And they report to you, that institution?
Similar to a bank, yeah. And anybody who's providing those services, whether it's opening an e-gold account or facilitating the transaction through to another country, they are the reporting point for AUSTRAC.
Right. So if I was to set up an e-gold currency, though, in Bermuda, would I be captured by our laws?
No, the geographic link part of the Act wouldn't apply.
Wouldn't apply. So, but as an Australian consumer, I could set up an account with a Bermuda-based e-gold financial institution, presumably, and you wouldn't see what I do.
No, we wouldn't see what you do, but I guess you would have to move money out of Australia if you were based in Australia to pay for that e-gold. So you would have to kind of interact with the financial system somehow in Australia to move the money, and that's what we would see, that there's money, a large amount of money.
That's interesting.
Going from your account to Bermuda, and that.
What if it's not generated in Australia, that money? What if you're an Australian citizen, you're generating it in another country, and there's no money transaction in Australia?
If there's no money transaction in Australia, then we won't see that account, and that's because Bitcoin has that mining aspect.
No.
So the money, I wanted to move to the Bitcoin world next then. So if I was same principle, and I'm an Australian consumer and I want to buy Bitcoins, if I'm buying them through my account in the Commonwealth Bank, you can see that. You can see them buying Bitcoins. You could see that now. We should always preface these questions. If you need to not answer them, I'm not going to be offended. If you can't comfortable. Yes, exactly. But can you see that now? Would you be able to?
Yes. So for example, if it was the Commonwealth Bank, the broker would be a customer of the Commonwealth Bank or whichever bank, and because the bank is required to identify and verify and know their customer, they would know that that customer is a Bitcoin exchanger. And then as you deposit money into their account, they'll be able to see, under the existing regime, money going into that exchange, and they'll be able to determine from that you've kind of moved money into it. And then you presumably get the Bitcoins, but then what happens with those Bitcoins, we don't see unless it comes out the off-ramp at another point for the Australian
But that's no different than the e-gold situation. You won't see the transactions done within the e-gold account if it's held offshore or outside of our regulatory regime.
Well, except that the people who provide e-gold, the service providers for e-gold are regulated entities, so they have reporting requirements.
But not if they're based offshore, like I said earlier. Didn't we establish that? If the e-gold operates outside of our regulatory scope, you won't see what they do.
We'll see the money flow through because all the regulated entities are required to report what we call international funds transfer instructions, IFTIs, and that is any value amount that goes outside the country.
Okay, I'm just not quite following here. But if I transfer my money to Bermuda, to an e-gold financial institutions outside of our regulatory
Transfer it from a
geography,
bank?
yeah, you'll see the on-ramp, if you like.
Yep.
But while my money's in e-gold and I'm transacting with other e-gold customers to buy and sell services or goods or whatever I'm doing with it, you won't see those transactions.
No, we won't see
and
that.
then you possibly see them again when there's an off-ramp back into a financial institution covered by our laws. Is that clear? Am I right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
So it's the same as regular currency.
Yeah,
Like
yep.
if you moved it to a bank in Bermuda,
Well, you lose.
we lose sight of it while
Yep.
it's in Bermuda.
Okay. Now, going back to the Bitcoin space, so some elements of that are the same in the Bitcoin space, but you just mentioned to Senator Edwards, is there a further complication here in terms of the mining activity and the generation of the currency completely outside any framework that we cover?
That's right. So if it's mined offshore, or even if it's mined here,
Yeah, you don't see it.
we don't see it.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I don't know, we haven't asked other witnesses, and this is not really a question for you. What proportion of people would be earning their Bitcoin through mining, or it's a big concern, or?
Well, they wouldn't know because they don't have visibility.
Yeah, no, yes, you don't know.
I'm sorry, I can't answer that, but
That's a question
I
for
do
other
know
people in
that
the Bitcoin industry,
I think
which we
that
haven't asked, but anyway.
Bitcoin is created in a way where it gets harder and harder and harder to mine it.
Yeah.
So I guess the only thing I could say is that the mining issue, I think, becomes a smaller issue as time goes on.
Okay. And so if we were to try and take digital currency into the scope of our anti-money laundering legislation, we could potentially have the same oversight we have over e-currencies, right, and e-gold and other things, except for this mining aspect. Is that correct?
Well, not quite, because there's no centralised reporting entity. So with e-currency, if I wanted to transfer e-gold to you and you were located anywhere in the world, it would go through a centralised Australian provider who would report it to AUSTRAC. With a currency like Bitcoin, I can send it directly.
Just peer-to-peer.
Yeah, it's peer-to-peer. I'll send it directly to you, and we have no visibility until it comes out and off-ramp. So it can shoot all around the world until we see it again.
So,
And at the moment, there's not a lot. There's not a lot you can do with Bitcoin. There are a few providers who are taking it, but there's not. But as that grows, and the more you can live in the Bitcoin world, the less
visibility. Yeah.
the less visibility you have, because there's no need to bring it out of one of the off-ramps.
Yeah. So, I mean, could you, though, include Bitcoin institutions that do open accounts? The previous speaker referred to them usefully, I think, as custodial accounts. You know, if someone's opening an account where you deposit Bitcoin in, could those institutions be brought within our anti-money laundering laws, potentially?
Conceptually, yes.
Okay. But you still got this additional problem of peer-to-peer transactions, which presumably, if I want to be nefarious and not visible, I could easily do.
That's right.
Just effectively saying it's like an easier way of moving cash.
That's exactly right. You can move cash globally. It's
Without needing a suitcase.
without any suitcase. It's exactly like that.
So, and this is maybe a question you don't want to answer right now. What have you given thought to this peer-to-peer issue, and how our laws or framework might need to change to capture that?
We have certainly given it thought, but we're not alone either. There's, obviously it's an international phenomenon, so there's a range of countries who are giving it thought, as well as the Financial Action Task Force, which is the intergovernmental body which sets the standards for anti-money laundering and terrorism financing. So there's a lot of thought going on, but at the moment, I don't think there's any sort of solid solutions, and it's definitely something we're looking at as part of the Act, and we're looking at the review of the Act that's going on.
Okay.
And it's something that we're working on, but I don't think at this stage that we have the kind of silver bullet for how to do it.
So can you tell me about the review then? What's happening there?
So that started in December 2013, but it was almost a kind of dual process with the Financial Action Task Force's mutual evaluation that we had. So that's the kind of check that the FATF comes and does on how our AML CTF system stacks up against the international standards. So that report was finalised at the meeting in Paris last Friday, and there's going to be some changes made following that final meeting. And when we have the final report, that's obviously going to be a major kind of component of informing how we move forward in the review, so that we can regulate in a way which meets international standards. So we are proposing to take into account the final of that report, plus also throw into the mix the other factors that aren't included in that report. So Bitcoins are obviously part of that because they're not a FATF requirement at this stage. So how we kind of deal with technology, and there's a range of other issues as well that we're looking at, which sit outside the kind of mutual evaluation issues.
Can I ask a quick question on that? Sorry, just for my sake, just take one step back.
Sure.
Mr. Moss, is effectively what you're saying and the AFP and the ACCC are all kind of, I think, saying the same thing, which I want to check, which is effectively this. Firstly, this is all new and it's all evolving. Secondly, that the current framework for anti-money laundering that has been created in this country and gets updated from time to time hasn't or when it was designed, hadn't obviously preempted the design of this new technology. I see you're on nodding, but I'm going to get your comment on this. Hadn't designed the technology. And thirdly, the challenge now is how do we create the right framework that allows us to get this to fall within the frameworks that we've obviously gotten established. But at this point in time, the challenge is that doesn't happen. And the AFP in particular, I note that we actually had, in some previous evidence, and I've got it here, at the committee's hearings in November, we had someone from ABA Technology, a Bitcoin ATM company, noting that their company does things like, they're effectively the anti-money laundering security features that are built into Bitcoin ATMs aren't actually even necessary under the law, because the law doesn't cover them. They don't exist under the law. So I wouldn't mind getting in touch on just the broad principle that you're saying that we need to have some laws in this space, and there's a process going on to identify those laws. Is that the right assessment, Mr. MOSSOP?
Yeah, I think so, and that's exactly right. That's part of the review. We think that there needs to be some sort of coverage of this technology because it doesn't seem to be, like you said, it's coming, it's not going away, and it's probably, all the signs point to the fact that it's going to continue to grow in its penetration across the country. So we think given that the risks that we've identified in our submission are there needs to be some form of regulation to cover that.
Okay, just the thing that I don't understand, which strikes me as quite simple. Okay, AUSTRAC, and we may get them in at some point, but applying AUSTRAC to the Bitcoin exchanges, just some simple measures like that, are they the kinds of things we're looking at, just expanding what AUSTRAC? I mean, to me it seems like if I wanted to buy Bitcoin, I mean, there's two ways to get Bitcoin. I can mine Bitcoin, I can buy Bitcoin. Right? Most people are going to buy Bitcoin because mining Bitcoin's become harder and harder and harder. I'm using Bitcoin as an example, we can use it. But just simply applying AUSTRAC to the exchanges, wouldn't that fix a lot of these kind of concerns? Are there some simple things we can do to address some of that?
Yes, absolutely. So that's the option that I think the Canadian authorities have taken, and the US authorities as well have taken that as potentially a first step. But I guess there's other ways. So I think we've noticed that you've said there's been evidence about the ATMs. So the ATMs don't, as I understand it, work as exchanges. They simply connect peer-to-peer transactions. So I guess there's some work to do in working out exactly what exchanges are, but that is definitely a step that you could take, which would give you a window in to the transactions that are taking place in Bitcoin. What it doesn't solve is that peer-to-peer problem of what happens within the system. So that's the additional layer of challenge that we have with currencies like Bitcoin.
I would suggest there's a third way to acquire Bitcoin. So, of course, you can purchase Bitcoin, be it through a exchange or through a peer-to-peer system. You can mine Bitcoin. Alternatively, you can obtain Bitcoin by providing goods and services.
Yep.
And having Bitcoin as a payment.
Yep.
And I think this is the complex part of this equation, is that with every emerging technology, amongst the early adopters will be criminal elements. It fits the way organised crime in particular works. So they build their criminal enterprise around markets and risk. How you move value rather than money is part of that risk model. So really we see Bitcoin being used with its goods and services for either cybercrime, money laundering, or in the darknet environment. So you need to consider virtual currencies concurrently with darknet trends. You can't buy off a darknet using cash unless the commodity is delivered to you. And most of the darknet traffic is transnational and paid for in virtual currency. So the two things go hand in hand. Without a virtual currency, it becomes very complex to use darknets to purchase illicit commodities, drugs, narcotics, or as we've seen in the US, biotoxins. So the two things must be considered as a regulatory problem concurrently. Not only, at present we're not seeing until, as your previous speaker talked about, governments who can purchase aircraft carriers, large-scale money laundering. But you are seeing large volumes of mum and dads purchasing illicit commodities over the internet. And we're seeing organised crime groups such as OMCGs in recent media reporting using Bitcoins as a standard way to move value. You can buy a coffee with Bitcoin in Canberra. I mean, it's no complexity in that. The question is, I think we have a unique window here for regulation before we escalate to moving millions or buying aircraft carriers.
And is your evidence, Mr. Moss, that that's a window that we need to seize?
Yes, it is.
So can I just drill down there? You said there are large numbers of mums and dads using digital currencies to buy illicit goods. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And this is largely narcotics, or?
The primary detection is around narcotic importation, new synthetic drugs, or the standard of...
So you can obviously have some visibility of that now.
Good point. Yes.
How do you get that visibility?
I think that's a question for Canberra.
Okay, all right, no problems. I wanted to ask a related question to that point later, and again, you can take this in camera. To what extent is there a relationship here between your AML laws and the other laws where the Parliament's currently considering on metadata and changes to telecommunication oversight, given that all of these transactions occur over a telecommunication service or over the internet? Is that another way we can get visibility on these transactions through better surveillance of electronic communication?
That's a good question from Canberra as well.
Okay, all right.
Okay, well, we might do that then. I note that it's 10 past.
Can I just ask a couple of others?
Ask a couple of others, and then we might spend 15 minutes in camera, if that's okay.
I just wanted to ask two more questions. One about the anonymity of the transactions, and I think Mr. Taggart, in your remarks or some of the remarks before, and we had a session earlier, I'm still trying to establish what is the degree of anonymity of these transactions. Obviously, they're more anonymous than transferring through your bank. Are they as anonymous as cash, though? Where does it sit on the scale there?
I think that's a good question for in camera.
Good. Okay, final one. Know your customer rules. That's a separate piece of legislation? Is that right, to the AML? But they are still...
No, so that's part of the anti-money laundering legislation.
Okay.
So that's a component of...
Right.
of the
And
checks.
who regulates that exactly? Is that ASIC or is that you guys?
That's AUSTRAC.
AUSTRAC does know your customer. Okay, so you communicate in consultation with, is it APRA or ASIC or RBA? Because presumably these bodies that are being captured by Know Your Customer rules are also regulated by the financial regulators. Is that right, or you're completely separate?
Yeah. So the identification is required to be done by the actual entity. So if you go into a bank and you provide your identification, they do all that. Then the transactions that relate to that are reported to AUSTRAC, and then AFP, ACC, a range of other what we call designated agencies have access to AUSTRAC information, either by transmission by AUSTRAC or direct access to AUSTRAC's database themselves.
And the system works well. There's no real overlap between your space and the other financial regulator space?
No, not a lot. Not only kind of where you would want it, I think.
Okay. All right. Okay.
All right, well, we might, for 15 minutes, sorry to ask our guests here from Treasury and other places who have come, but we might go into camera for
Some soft couches out on
for 15 minutes. Okay, thank you so much. I now welcome officers from the Treasury and the Australian Taxation Office. For the Hansard record, could you state your full name and the capacity in which you appear?
Start?
Yes.
Hello, I'm Brett Peterson. I'm from the Australian Taxation Office.
Hello, I'm Michael Hardy. I'm from the Australian Taxation Office.
Kate Preston, General Manager, Treasury.
Daniel McAULIFFE, Manager of the Banking and Capital Markets Unit in Treasury.
Jessica Moore, Acting Manager in Treasury.
Look, thank you so much for coming here. Thank you for participating in our inquiry. Thank you for your submissions. A lot of this actually, from the Tax Office, kind of came about as a kind of response in part, and I know Mr. Hardy is very well aware of all this, to the tax treatment of digital currency, which kind of triggered a bit of a debate about, and I think that the advice from the ATO at the time, publicly and privately, and I think even in Senate estimates was, well, look, we don't really have a regulatory framework. This is all new, and the regulatory framework we've got was designed a while back, and we're dealing with this the way in which the law tells us that we should be dealing with this, and we're dealing with it, I think, a commodity as opposed to a currency, because that's what fits the best description. But let's be honest, these are words that were created and frameworks that were created in a different era. And so the challenge for us now is, from a taxation perspective, how do we treat this? Should we, and how do we treat this differently? And again, did you have opening remarks or kind of an opening statement, or do you want to get straight to questions, Mr. Hardy?
No opening statement.
Just briefly, I think you're right, Senator. The Tax Office came to this issue with the approach of it's happening, use of Bitcoin transactions happening, and we need to provide some certainty for the community about what is the tax treatment and the tools we had available to us with existing law. So that's the approach we took, was to understand the technology, understand the business models, see if the existing law could or did apply, and then to provide the advice. We took the approach of being as collaborative as possible. We worked with experts, industry associations, banking, finance, tax, accounting sort of professionals as well. And I think just in terms of the intervening period since we made our submission to the inquiry, we have finalised rulings which were draft at the time we made our submissions. We've finalised 4 tax determinations, income tax determinations, and a GST public ruling, but in effect they're all public rulings. The finalisation of them didn't depart materially from our draft opinion, which we'd had to provide since August. It provided additional information and clarification, but didn't change anything materially. Since that time, we've continued to monitor the environment. Internet.
When was the final?
The final ones came out on the 17th of December.
Okay.
So, we've continued to monitor the international sort of tax regulatory environment. No major changes we've noticed around the world and tax positions of other countries. Some minor revisions. Belgium, I think, have come to the view that Bitcoin as perhaps the primary example of cryptocurrencies they think is out of scope of their VAT regime. Finland decided that the transactional fees on Bitcoin transactions are outside their VAT regime, but they're all, I think, across Europe, the European Union, are waiting for the European Court of Justice decision, a question put by Sweden to the European Court of Justice on sort of the correct VAT treatment for Bitcoin. From a compliance perspective, we haven't a sense of a great enhanced non-compliance risk with Bitcoin transactions. Of course, people don't put on their tax returns, this was my money from Bitcoin, it's just part of their assessable income. But our own monitoring hasn't indicated that there's a particularly high non-compliance risk from Bitcoin transactions. And our sense is that the business community, if not necessarily in full agreement with the advice that we provide of the operation of the existing law, have at least appreciated the degree of certainty we've provided. And several businesses approached us saying, I've got an alternate business model, what would be the private ruling of tax treatment with this business model, so they can properly take that into account in terms of getting on with their commercial activity. So that's roughly the environment we're seeing.
Mr. Hardy, just to unpack that a bit. Firstly, I mean, your rulings are obviously your rulings. Your rulings are an application of the law as it currently stands. The question for us is the framework and the framework that we've created, you know, the right framework, and do the laws in this space as part of this kind of review need to change. The evidence that we've been given is that there is well, the two issues. Firstly, there's a question about whether there is, that they feel that they're being, again, I'm not disputing you're applying the law as it currently stands. I'm not challenging that, but that there's a kind of, they're being double taxed, and you know they're kind of effectively being double taxed on it. Firstly, but secondly, that what this does is it creates an environment, because of the ease with which these things can be done offshore. It just creates a very, very easy environment. Well, effectively what you've done, we have evidence to this effect. I mean, we had some people who made some submissions and given evidence, effectively saying, well, the outcome of this is we're still living in Australia, but we just run the business out of Singapore or Hong Kong or wherever because the tax treatment's so different. And it makes such a big difference in how we do our business. And then the bizarre situation where even the Bitcoin ATMs that exist in shopping centres, there's a handful of them around the place, are actually technically doing the transaction in Singapore because of the technology is so easy to move, yet the tax treatment's so different. I wouldn't mind getting your take on whether you feel it's time for a bit of a review in terms of how we define these things, firstly, and secondly, whether I understand the amounts of money we're talking about are fairly small at this point in time, but whether there's a risk that if we don't get the right regulatory framework, we're effectively going to, you know, rather than generate more money by the GST treatment, we're effectively just driving the whole thing overseas, which ends up losing money in the long term, noting it's all very small at this point in time.
It does follow that there is a mob called CoinLoft that says you've given them a ruling that says GST doesn't apply.
And while I couldn't comment on any particular taxpayers' affairs, different business models, with the application of the existing law might give different tax outcomes because the business model, the underlying business model, is a different model.
Okay, well, your question is that, you know, are we doing ourselves in the eye for, you know, having a tax treatment, and should this be a business that we should be in? And then you're saying a different business model attracts a different ruling, but both of these companies, both of these people are asserting that they're Bitcoin exchanges.
If I might then, perhaps I've answered that first and I'll come back to the question, and then I think there's some aspects for Treasury as well. Okay. Broadly, and very, very broadly, there's perhaps two business models by which an exchange, a Bitcoin type of exchange, might operate. One is that an exchange would buy, acquire, mine its own, but hold Bitcoin in its own right as principal, and you come along and say, I'd like to buy some Bitcoin, and they say, yes, Bitcoin for Australian dollars, whatever it might be, or you sell Bitcoin to them and they yes say, thank you very much, and they then hold that as part of their own personal, their business holdings. So that's one model. And probably perhaps the first arising model we saw most commonly. An alternative model, and there are a multitude of variations, so this is broad families of models. An alternate model is perhaps more like a brokerage arrangement whereby an exchange says that I don't hold any Bitcoin, but if you think that you'd like to buy some Bitcoin, I think I know some people who could sell some Bitcoin and I can introduce you. I can introduce you for a fee. And so the exchange to the public appears to be the same. You go there, you get Bitcoin, but behind the scene mechanics of how the transactions are structured and arranged are different, are legally different, are both legal structures but legally different, and the operation of tax laws to those two particular models, one which is an agency type model, one which is a principal type model, can have different tax outcomes just because of the operation of tax law. So that's so while to the public both look like exchanges, you could see a different tax outcome.
Okay, but then you'll apply a GST on the fee.
Well, in the first model, for example, with the principal, again, very, very broadly, most likely the business itself is required to be registered for GST. They're making a supply to a citizen, a person, and so because of the GST treatment regard of Bitcoin, that's not money or financial supply, it's in fact a type of product, so you're having a barter transaction, they supply Bitcoin and they need to charge GST on that. In the second circumstance, it might be that the exchange introduces the customer saying, I'd like to buy some Bitcoin to another person, which might be perhaps myself as a private individual, and so as a private individual I'm not registered or required to be registered for GST. When I supply my GST to the customer through the introduction service, I'm not charging GST on the supply of the Bitcoin, nor am I legally required to do so. The agency fee, which is a small part of the transaction, there may be GST on the agency fee, but not on the total Bitcoin transaction volume. So, and yet to the person wanting to acquire Bitcoin, under either pathway, they acquire Bitcoin. Yep. So, but that's broadly, different business models can give different tax treatment.
I get it.
As to your question, Chair, perhaps primarily about are there double taxation issues as have been presented to you? Yes, we recognised in some commercial circumstances there can be double taxation. This isn't confined just to Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. It's a feature of barter transactions, and effectively a Bitcoin transaction in the tax environment is a barter transaction, so it's swapping a sheep for a goat, if you like. Barter transactions, of course, are not very common, and so it perhaps hasn't been a topical issue, but they perhaps became more common with the visibility of and the excitement of Bitcoin transactions, and so this particular issue of how Bitcoin might be charged twice in a barter environment became perhaps a more prominent question. So that's, again, nothing new, nothing confined just to Bitcoin. As to whether that's a good or a bad thing, that's really a policy question to which I'd defer to my Treasury colleagues.
We might just ask the Treasury colleagues again. I'm not asking you kind of...
Welcome back by the way from last week.
If I can put that question to you about kind of the policy ramifications of... Again, when we're talking... except we're not talking about a huge... What we're interested in is this is obviously something that's growing. We understand that at the moment the amount of revenue we're talking about is fairly minor in the scheme of Australian taxation, but with the potential to grow.
Yeah, and I think that Treasury have been monitoring the Bitcoin space both from a regulatory perspective and a tax perspective. I would say that we have no issues with the way that the ATO has dealt with it. I mean, it's their role to interpret the law. They've done that. I think we will continue to assess the environment, but I would stress that it is an industry, if you like, in its infancy. So I think to jump in and suggest that there should be changes to the tax law to accommodate it is a little bit early in that process.
But isn't the issue here that we may not get an industry here in this country, at least, unless we made those changes. I mean, we had evidence this morning, it was quite right, that to facilitate other technological developments, the internet, roads, railroads as well, we had to change our legislative framework to help facilitate those things. And some countries did that better than others at times. So is there not a risk if our laws don't keep up with things? Notwithstanding it's small, that's perhaps time to do it, to facilitate the growth.
Again, I mean, I think the Treasury view would be that taxation is not where you start, in where there's a lack of, I guess, a sense from the tax office that the current laws aren't working. That, you know, if there was going to be a response, perhaps, you know, it is from, first of all, considering that there is no regulatory environment, and perhaps, you know, starting there rather than at the tax end.
Okay. On that, Mr. President, we'll get to that in a second. I just wanted to, my understanding of the evidence from Mr. Hardy, so I just want to get this kind of correct, Mr. Hardy, is your evidence isn't that, your evidence is that effectively the framework now the tax officer's view is the framework obliges us to treat it like a barter transaction. That's the...
In summary?
Yeah. And the concern that Senator Canavan was expressing as a concern of the industry, we're just effectively putting back to you evidence that's been put to us, is that the danger of that kind of treatment, if we don't have a framework that's open that allows it to grow, is effectively one of two things. Either you send it overseas and you send the industry overseas, or you kind of stifle it. Ms. Preston, I mean, I wanted to ask you on that and ask you on one other variation on that as well. The question of, there's the complex question about what is a currency and what does that mean in the modern world, and you know, what is a commodity, and it gets very complicated when we're dealing with non-fiat currencies because these are terms that were invented in a different era with different meanings. Is there a possibility to be able to address the taxation issues to do with double taxation of digital currency without necessarily the broader consequences of dealing with something as a currency? The second you call something a currency, there's a whole set of other laws that effectively come in, you know, about how you can do your annual returns and this and that. But it seems to be the taxation issue seems to be the more pressing one, without necessarily delving into the whole world and this bigger debate that will happen over the next 20 years of what does currency mean in the modern world, which is a whole, you know, theses and PhDs are getting written on.
Yeah, Senator, I take your point. I don't think we've given enough thought to that for me to be able to answer that.
Can you take that on notice?
Well, that's a developmental
Yeah,
process, isn't it?
it's a developmental process. So no, I don't think I can take that on notice.
But wasn't your question, sorry, I was floating in and out, I thought your question was if the law was changed to well, if we treated Bitcoin as a currency, are there other related laws, not necessarily a tax law, which would complicate that interpretation, that change of interpretation? That's just a basic question of our current law and framework. We're not asking you to give an opinion on policy. Just the basic framework. Look, maybe there's not that issue. Is that an accurate interpretation?
To frame it slightly differently, is there a way of addressing the taxation issues with digital? So, is there a way of addressing the taxation issues with digital currency? And some of that may need either regulation or legislation. I'm not quite sure. I don't know the act well enough to deal with the taxation issues without necessarily dealing with the whole range of other bigger issues that are a consequence of the term currency. I'm saying, is there a halfway house there while we kind of work out where all this is going? And again, if you can take that on notice, that's
or it may not be an issue at all.
Yeah.
I don't know. So, Ms. Preston, you're not taking that on notice? Or?
Well, you know, my initial thoughts would be, you know, if the government was of a mind to change the law, they can change the law. You know, if they were going to change the GST law, for example, you know, there are problems with doing that, in that this would be a change to the base. The states and territories would need to agree to that. I wouldn't see at this point in time, or even, you know, in the near future, that the states and territories would treat this as an issue of major concern, but I can't speak for them. So, I mean, the law can always be changed in absence, but in absence of, I guess, a holistic consideration.
Well, that's not the question I'm asking. I can't speak for the chair, but I think what I interpret him asking is a relevant question and not a question about what the law may be in the future. In fact, it's a question about what the law is now. So maybe if I put it in my terms, what I am asking is, can we interpret Bitcoin as currency for the purposes of the tax law, in particular the GST, without it having knock-on ramifications for other laws, be they financial oversight, prudential, consumer protection, etc. Are there interconnections in our laws between the interpretation of something as a currency in our tax law and the other related financial legislation and oversight that we have? That's all I'm asking.
You worded it a lot better than I did.
Now, yeah, if you can't answer that right now, Ms. Preston, that's fine. I'm happy for you to take that on notice.
Yeah, I think we'll take that on notice.
Okay, thank you. Do you want?
We can keep going.
Well, I wanted to, in the words, as my illustrious chair would say, is take a step back.
Or even unpack it.
Unpack it as well.
Well.
Sorry, it's an in-joke. I'm still struggling a little to understand how bartering is captured under the GST law. So what? Let's take it to a sheep and goat world where I trade a sheep for a goat. How is that actually dealt with right now? Like, who pays the GST and
Perhaps I can help, Senator.
Okay.
That would be great.
The GST law is predicated on this notion of taxing a supply.
Yep.
In the case of trading a sheep for a goat, assuming everybody's registered and those sorts of things.
I'm trading lots of sheep.
What effect?
National Party.
That's right.
Libs have got sheep. I don't care.
The person who provides the sheep will receive consideration for it, and there'll be...
That's the goats?
That's right, and there'll be some value attributable...
Yes, to the goats.
To the goats. And that particular person will receive the GST and remit it. And if they have any...
So have to pay 10% more goats for it, right, okay.
If they have any credits associated with providing those supplies, then they'll be able to claim those, and there'll be net amount owing, or perhaps they'll be entitled to a refund, depending on how the arithmetic works. Exactly the same process happens from the other side. So exactly the same kind of arrangement. So that's the two-way deal with barter. Tax gets paid both ways. Both sides then will claim a bit of a credit, and ultimately it nets out.
Only if both of those sides are registered.
Only if both of those sides are registered. The difference occurs with money, because the GST law says that a supply of money is not a supply for GST purposes unless it's a supply of money for money. So if we trade the goat for cash, Australian currency, then the GST has to be charged on the sheep, remitted. There's no GST implication the other way. If, on the other hand, you or I went down to TravelX and we exchanged our Australian dollars for US dollars, then it's a supply of money for money.
So you don't.
And that no GST on it, but that transaction is input taxed.
Yep.
And the issue with, or the fact with input tax transactions, is that the business making the supply cannot claim credits associated with with the transaction.
Okay, that's a lot clearer for me. So
I reckon it's the second time we've done that this morning.
Is that right? So is there something I can explain a little differently?
No, that's clearer for me.
I'm clear, you're clear.
Yep.
Sorry, I thought you hadn't got me.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm being sincere.
We don't do that here. Self-deprecating.
I just wanted to clarify, though, what particular aspects of our law, and I'm very specific here, what aspects of a new tax system or whatever the GST law is now called contain these provisions?
Okay. Well, when we talk about tax, we're talking about a bundle of different laws.
Yep.
So we've been talking about GST, there's also income tax law, and relevantly here there's also fringe benefits tax laws. So if we go to GST, there are really two issues broadly on the table, I'd say, from the industry perspective. The first is the definition of money, and you've no doubt heard a lot about the definition of money. And you've heard about Travelex, and you've heard people arguing for a utility test and so on. Money is defined in the GST law, and it says money includes, and there's a list of a range of things, and it starts with currency, Australian or foreign.
Australian or foreign?
Australian or foreign. Right. And our view, of course, is that Bitcoin is neither of those things.
Okay. Yep. Okay.
So if Bitcoin were money, then the let's go back to trading.
Just to clarify, that definition is in the GST law or
it's
some
in the
other law?
It's in the GST law. It's section 195- something or other.
Could you take that on notice? Get us that section. That would be fantastic.
It will be section 195. Section 195 of the GST legislation is definitions. It goes for pages.
Okay.
So you'll find 195, and alphabetically you'll come down to something money. And then say money means, and then gives you the list.
Senator, I've just told you a fib. I'm sorry. It's no, I haven't. It's 195-1 is the section number.
Okay.
All the definitions are in the dictionary. It's section 195-1.
Right.
If Bitcoin were money, then let's go back to buying sheep for Bitcoin. Then the person providing the sheep would need, again assuming registration and all the rest, would need to charge GST on the transaction and remit that money, and then they'd claim their credits as they were due. If Bitcoin were money, then the supply of Bitcoin in the other direction would not be subject to GST. If it's treated as a commodity or a good, or we would say an intangible property, right, it's subject to GST.
Yep, okay.
The second issue, however, is you'll remember that the second element of the definition of supply is that money provided for money is our supply. So the example we've just been through would be relevant to perhaps a trader who chooses to buy their trading stock or their cups or their sandwiches or whatever from somebody for Bitcoin. Our understanding, though, is that those sorts of circumstances are relatively unusual because most traders are swapping their Bitcoin for Australian currency as part of a way of managing risk and volatility. And in fact, that's a feature that most of the point of sale operators are highlighting, as we understand, the fact that they're converting to Australian currency very quickly. So our belief is that circumstance is probably relatively uncommon. It's no doubt occurring, but it's relatively uncommon. The real issue for the Bitcoin exchanges is the second part of this notion of supply, because a supply of money for money is still a supply, and it's caught within the system. That brings us to the second important area, and that concerns financial supplies in the GST system. So a supply ordinarily attracts GST, but the law has a chapter devoted to exemptions, and some supplies are GST free, and some supplies are input taxed. Financial supplies, a change of money for money, are input taxed. And the consequence of that is the person making the supply doesn't have to charge GST on it, but they can't claim the credits associated with making that supply. If the supply is GST free, they don't have to charge GST, but they're still able to claim the credits associated with making the supply. The Travelex example I gave you before, that's an example of a financial supply and it's input taxed. Unless, of course, it happens on the other side of the departures area at Sydney Airport.
Yep. So when you say it's input tax, just to clarify, that means they can't claim.
Means they don't pay GST. They don't charge GST on the transaction.
Yep. And they can't.
But they can't claim the credits associated with making the supply.
That's why it's input tax, because they can't claim the credits related to the input tax.
That's right. And now the issue of financial supplies is dealt with at subdivision 40-A of the GST law. It's the notion of a financial supply. What is a financial supply is defined in the regulations. You will not find the word money in the regulations around financial supplies. That definition is tighter. It says that a financial supply relates to an interest in or under a matter mentioned in an item in the following table, and then there are a range of things. And that includes bank accounts provided by ADIs, for example, an annuity or allocated pension, mortgages, and relevantly, it says Australian currency, the currency of a foreign country, or an agreement to buy or sell currency of either kind. The notion of money doesn't operate in relation to financial supplies. So even if we agree today that Bitcoin was money, the exchange arrangements that are in place would still be
subject to GST. It wouldn't be exempt. It wouldn't be a financial supply.
No, that's right.
So I was going to ask that. So we could, of course, change the definition of money to digital currency or some definition. That would mean that for the supply of that good in this case, that is digital currency, it would not be GST. There would not be GST payable on that supply. That's right. Just to confirm.
If Bitcoin were
defined as a money,
were defined as money, then the provision of Bitcoin for something other than money would not be subject to GST.
But it would not be exempt. The financial supply or the business of supplying digital currency would still be liable for GST.
Yes, because it would still be a supply for GST purposes as a supply of money for money.
But then if we included digital currency along with Australian currency and foreign currency, it would similarly be exempt.
In the financial supplies definition.
And that's in regulations, not in the law that you went through.
It's in a regulation. Would you like the regulation number?
Maybe on notice. I probably don't need a table right now.
Just getting my... Sorry, Senator Cameron understands this better than I do, so my apologies. I just need to unpack it a bit. So you're saying that there's a definition of money and there's a list of what a money is defined as? That's in a schedule or no, is it part of the Act?
The definition of money is in the dictionary in the GST Act itself. It's section 195-1.
Okay. So that's within the Act, that's not... Okay. And then separate to that, there's a regulation.
There are a range of regulations. One of which, or a number of which, in fact, relate to financial supplies, which is this exchange type transaction, money for money.
And is the question you can take on notice is whether this can be changed simply through regulation or to address the concerns, but it sounds like is there a way, and again, this question take on notice, I'm not asking you to answer this now, Mr. Hardy, if you can take, Mr. President, if you can take this on notice, to address the concerns. Again, these are policy decisions for government, should they choose to want to do this. But if that was the path that we wanted to go down, is there a way of doing this simply through regulation, or do we need both regulation and legislation? Is there a way around changing the legislation to only do it through regulation, or would we need, or is the definition of money so vital to this that you'd actually have to change that to be able to do this? Take that on notice. I'm not asking you that's a very technical question.
Well, can I maybe just one straight away? It seems to me that the definition of money in Section 195 and the regulations you mentioned about defining what is a financial supply, and that's the right term, is it, defining what is a financial supply? They're quite unrelated in that way, because you mentioned before that money's not mentioned in the regs, so to speak.
Money is not a term. Relevantly, the regulation refers to Australian currency, or the currency of a foreign country.
So there's no cross-references directly between either of those?
No, there's no cross-references, at least as far as I can.
No provision in the Act to define money through a regulation?
There's no cross-references except to the degree that the term currency is used in the definition of money in the GST Act.
Okay. Yep,
so the same term is used, not sort of a referential thing, the same term.
And is there a provision in the GST Act to change or add or subtract to the definition of money through a regulation, or that's set in the legislation?
Senator, I think we need to think about
Take that on notice.
I'm tempted to say probably not, but in all honesty, should think about it.
If you could take that on notice, that'd be great. I have just lost my train of thought. Sorry, has anyone else got a question?
I've got a couple of kind of quick ones. So Mr. Hardy, it's fair to say, or is it? We heard Mr. Antonopoulos earlier today. I'm not sure if you had a chance to hear him. He was a very, very impressive speaker. Fair to say that Bitcoin's currently being used by some as money, whether it's defined as money in Australian law or not, but for the purpose of paying bills, buying a cup of coffee. Some of it can be nefarious, but effectively,
yes,
aircraft carrier
for transactions.
For transactions, right? It's being used as a means of transactions. Okay. So this is the kind of quirky part of Australian law, which I read something about, but I want to check it if it's right. If suddenly some obscure nation that exists on the list of nations that we recognise decided that their currency was going to be Bitcoin, it would automatically be recognised in everything else under our law. I read this weird article that said I just wanted to. This is a bit quirky.
Goes to the income tax. So we're just discussing GST legislation. Yeah. In the income tax legislation, and I can't think of the relevant section, there is a definition of foreign currency, I think, in the income tax legislation, which, paraphrasing, and probably paraphrasing poorly for my legally qualified colleagues, foreign currency is the currency of a foreign country. And so the argument would be that if a country chose to adopt Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency as their national currency, either, I guess, solely or perhaps in partnership with some pre-existing currency, that by pure definition it represents the currency of a foreign country, and therefore it would be foreign currency as defined in the Australian income tax legislation, and by virtue of that, that opens up different income tax treatments or interpretation where that term is used through the income tax legislation. I would imagine that tax lawyers would quickly say, is that an automated thing because effectively another country's decision automatically has an impact here, or is there some moderating force? And I don't, that hasn't been explored, but I know that the argument has been made is that it would be automatically required to be recognised as foreign currency just by virtue of it would qualify as foreign currency in the Australian income tax legislation just because another country recognised it as their sovereign currency.
Perhaps I can help, Senator. the dictionary section of the Income Tax Assessment Act, the 97 Act, says that foreign currency means a currency other than Australian currency. And
what was that, foreign currency?
Means a currency other than Australian currency. And Australian currency is dealt with in the Currency Act, 1965. It says it's the Australian dollar and it's to be used for all purposes.
And that's the definition of the Income Tax Act.
The definition of the Income Tax Act says foreign currency means a currency other than Australian currency.
So it doesn't have to be adopted by a foreign government?
No, so that
it just has to be a currency.
So my bad paraphrasing.
No, so currency, Australian currency is fiat currency. Currency established under the Currency Act 1965. And our approach to this definition is that foreign currency would effectively be fiat currency of another country.
But that's not what the definition says, what you just said.
No, it doesn't say that
but that's your interpretation of it?
But that's our interpretive approach.
So your interpretation of that definition of the Income Tax Act is it has to be a currency of another nation's government to qualify as a foreign currency?
Yes, broadly put, yes.
But it doesn't say that.
We'd say that that's the correct interpretive approach, bearing in mind that it uses the notion Australian currency, which has a particular legal meaning, and it puts in opposition to that currency other than Australian currency. So
the interpretive...
I'm not following. It says any currency other than Australian currency.
That's right, and so the interpretive rules that the tax office would use are exactly the same as the High Court, Federal Court, or the court system in Australia would use in terms of the precedents and approach to legal interpretation. Sure. And so taking the approach that Australian currency, a word used in that definition, is a defined term, which takes us off to go and have a look at the Currency Act in Australia, gives us some context of how these terms should be interpreted. Foreign currency is something other than Australian currency, which gives us the statutory implication that you should be looking to. Therefore, foreign currency is the currency of a foreign country that would fit into that if you like, that country's Currency Act or comparable. Very, very crudely described.
Senator, that there's a court authority to the effect that currency consists of notes or coins of denominations expressed as units of account of a country and issued under the laws of that country for use as a medium of exchange or wealth. So we've applied what we believe is the correct interpretive approach based on the case law. And so we're cognizant of the argument that if another country unilaterally adopted Bitcoin as its fiat currency, then it could readily be considered to be foreign currency for the range of purposes in Australia. But that's not a new notion. If a foreign country decided on seashells...
Yeah, of course. I mean...
And we do know there are some...
In that definition, any currency other than an Australian currency, Australian is an adjective there because it's modifying the noun. But currency sits without any adjective. I mean, the equivalent here is if I said any shirt other than a red shirt, and you interpret that to be, well, it has to be red to be that any other shirt because the red's in the definition. But any shirt other than a red shirt surely means any colour shirt.
Still a shirt.
Still a shirt. Still a currency. So I'm not... Where's this definition of currency?
I think, we would certainly go to the fact that we need to be looking at a shirt, and if there are some accepted concepts about what is a shirt, as opposed to a pullover, as opposed to perhaps a blouse, if that was a relevant distinction.
Is it Australian wool?
We would attempt to...
Yeah, where is this? Because look, I'm an economist, so I'm not a lawyer. And when I hear currency, I don't necessarily think of government currency, because certainly in history there have been, and there probably are still some examples in the world, currencies that haven't been issued by governments. Indeed, the very foundation of money, when you learn about economics, it had nothing to do with governments. And it was used as a form of currency, a form of exchange. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you learn in an economics textbook, what is currency? It needs to have three things: a unit of accounts, a store of value, and a medium of exchange. Now, none of those necessarily involve government. So
And we recognise the economic views of currency, understand that, but the task for the Australian Taxation Office was to interpret the taxation legislation as opposed to just economic concepts. And under the Australian taxation legislation, with the what we had in terms of legislation and the interpretive tools of legal interpretation, we've provided our best interpretation of the law we have. So we do understand the economic arguments, we understand a whole range of utility arguments, a whole range of other arguments which are quite appropriate in their fields of expertise. It just wasn't the field that we were required to interpret in, which is the taxation legislation.
Okay. So, Mr. Hardy, can I come back then a second?
Yeah, you're right. There you go.
Okay. Just to put the framework right. In addition to the many things you do at the tax office, you're also head of the Bitcoin task force. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is that what's called, the digital currency or Bitcoin task force?
We call it Bitcoin task force.
Okay, Bitcoin task force. Okay. So, to go from the start, from the evidence...
I should say co-lead it with Mr. Peterson.
Oh, sorry, so Mr. Peterson. To go back to kind of the start of where and how we're all here and why we're all here. And I just want to tell you if you think my logic here is the correct logic and we're heading to the right place. Firstly, to an extent, digital currency is already here. If you just kind of yes, if you for the hands out record, they're not going to pick up.
Yes.
So digital currency is already here. Its use is small but growing. Is that a fair?
Yes.
Okay. We had the Crime Commission and the AFP and the Attorney General's Department in here moments ago, who presented a view that said, look, we acknowledge that this is in its infancy, and part of the reason why we need to get the regulatory environment right is because it's in its infancy. Now is the time to get it right. Once these things get big, it's a lot harder to try and retrofit rules onto them. It's better to kind of have the rules, especially from a security accounting framework. Is it fair to say at this point in time we have a taxation system which hadn't counted or factored in the emergence of digital currency? Why would they have? No one saw it coming. And now you've set a set of rules which best fit a new technology into an existing law.
Yes, well, certainly, it's certainly fair to say that taxation legislation didn't contemplate the sorts of technologies which underlie Bitcoin cryptocurrency. Absolutely
Why
true.
would they have? Yeah. If they had, whoever came up with it could have gone and done very well for themselves.
I do think the taxation legislation, though, is typically developed to be broadly applicable to economic transactional circumstances, so they allow for some evolution of things. And so we have felt reasonably comfortable able to take the factual circumstances of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, look at those particular facts, look at the available legislation, say how these facts apply to the legislation, and provide, we think, quite a clear guidance. We do understand, though, that not everyone may like where the guidance comes, what the guidance tells them, but we haven't felt that there were aspects of cryptocurrency which were just where there was no possible response in the existing legislation.
Well, there's always a response in legislation. I mean, but is it fair to say, Mr. Hardy, is part of, I guess, the position of the tax office, the question on how you deal with digital currency isn't so much, and as we move forward, isn't so much a question about, it's not so much a regulatory question, it's a policy question.
It is. I mean, it seems to be that when you boil it down, a lot of the concerns of the business community are that, as I think you've pointed out, people deal with Bitcoin just like it was money, but the taxation outcomes are not the same as if it's money, and they've largely said, well, we'd like to see parity of the treatment. The existing legislation doesn't give that particular parity, our interpretation of it doesn't give that parity of treatment. if it was to be changed or modified to give that parity treatment, that is a policy question.
Yeah. Yeah, effectively, and that's kind of the process we're going through now, and against the recommendations we'll make to government at the end of this process. Just to clarify, the question that we wanted to take on notice is if, and this is an if, that was the path the government wanted to go down, if you could provide some advice on notice on how you'd be able to do that, whether that can be done simply through regulation, whether that's to be done through regulation and legislation, and then obviously we can, form that as part of the views that should we want to, as a committee, put that to government.
Are you doing any work with any other taxation entities in other countries, your contemporaries in other countries? You're looking at any of those things? Because certainly in our previous witnesses, they're talking with other jurisdictions as to what their policies and how they're going to go forward. Are you embracing anything they're doing in Canada or the US or?
Certainly following their public pronouncements. We have obviously international relations with our counterparts or revenue authorities, and we have periodic conversations with them about where they stand on emerging issues. I think it's fair to say that probably lots of countries are very interested to see what the European Court of Justice might decide in their case for VAT, because that'll affect a large number of countries in Europe on their VAT, their GST equivalent. Of course, different countries have different legislative regimes. So the US, for example, doesn't have at a federal level a GST regime. So there's only perhaps partial comparison can be made there. Countries like Canada and New Zealand are much closer to the Australian sort of complete tax regulatory environment, so we observe what they do publicly and have conversations with them through sort of treaty and other relationships.
Interesting.
Well, I just ask then finally, perhaps a question for Ms Preston, Treasury. Have you at all looked at the tax or regulatory implications of defining digital currencies as both currency and money under the GST and income tax laws?
I think part of your question is regulatory, so it's
okay,
not really for me, it's for Daniel, but certainly from a tax perspective, I would say that we've given some thought to the taxation treatment of Bitcoin. As I said before, we feel that it's in its infancy, so we're keeping a watching brief. We talk to the ATO often about a range of issues, and Bitcoin would be one of them. But certainly on the regulatory side,
certainly we've had a look at how Bitcoin's treated from the other aspects of regulation, so financial services regulation, for example. So that's financial advice, dealing, financial markets, clearing, settlement arrangements, also ASIC's powers in terms of misleading, deceptive conduct in respect of financial products. Then from the...
Would that be a reference to the Mount, the Mount Gox in Japan, with the collapse of that? That was just a giant Ponzi scheme.
Yeah. So yeah, there's... and it's not the only one. So there have been other examples of exchanges that have fallen over. As again, this is a emerging industry. You'd expect there to be issues. So at the moment, largely ASIC's, financial regulation doesn't apply to Bitcoin. There are things related to Bitcoin which do still fall within the financial services regulation. For example, derivatives in relation to Bitcoins, money payment services relating to Bitcoin. Some of those can fall within the existing regime. Likewise, if you go further, if you go to the the Currency Act, the payment system regulation, again, it's a situation where the current regulatory arrangements do not generally apply to Bitcoin. So in terms of the financial regulation and payment system regulation, it's a bit of a different situation where there isn't regulation that's called that the industry is sort of objecting to. In fact, it's an actual situation where, for example, the industry domestically is trying to do self-regulation that, in some respects, sort of mirrors some of the actual legal requirements because they see that there's actual benefit in having a self-regulatory model. So it's where we're in that space is that, again, it's an emerging industry. We're monitoring it, and I think we're waiting on this inquiry to finish its deliberations before, again, coming back to it to look at it in a bit more detail.
Is there any other implications or any other, just one more question, the currency and money that are defined in those two acts, do they then flow through to other regulations or other laws that refer to those?
Yeah. So there is cross-references in the legislation.
Could you perhaps on notice provide us with those other laws that reference those definitions?
We can
okay.
do that.
Mr. President, just before we go, I know that revenue leakage is on the G20 agenda. Is this something that should be on that agenda as well? Is this a sufficient issue, or is it not big enough yet? I mean, revenue leakage, the Amazons, the Googles, and all of those things are very topical. They're in the news. Is this not really there yet? This issue?
Well, I mean, as far as we've looked at it, I think our understanding is there is no revenue leakage in relation to this, to Bitcoin.
No, I'm not putting it in that context. I'm just putting the regulation around what we're trying to form here. What the recommendations this inquiry is trying to do is, should there be a recommendation coming from this that Australia takes it to the G20 to, find some worldwide regulation in this space?
Look, my view is
probably answering my own question.
That would be a matter for government, but I mean, perhaps the ATO
sure.
is involved. So they're much more, I think, involved at the coalface with other jurisdictions on these sorts of issues. And perhaps they might have a view about whether this would be useful, for example, perhaps not for the G20, but certainly for the OECD to look at.
Senator, I think I have seen some OECD and or possibly G20 papers which at least discuss technological developments, so cryptocurrencies and things like collaborative consumption models, some of those. So I think it is in, and I don't know what level of intensity on the G20 or OECD radar, but I think there is some consideration of it there already.
Okay, all right. Well, that's encouraging. Thank you.
Now, also, we've got chamber duties, so we have to go. But I want to thank you so much for your submissions and your participation in this inquiry. And answers to question on notice, to get the report together, we're asking if they can be together by the 20th of March, if that's okay. But look, thank you so much, and thank you for your participation in our inquiry. And we hope to keep in touch. Thank you. I now close this meeting of the Senate Economics References Committee.